Let's make a start. Hello and welcome to the Centre for Child Protection's Critical Conversations in Child Protection webinar series. My name is Venetia Jassel and I'm a Senior Lecturer and Director of Studies at the Centre. The objective of this series is to facilitate learning from the latest research, practice knowledge, theory and lived experiences around safeguarding children and young people. It is for a multi-professional group of child protection professionals, including health, education, police, social work, third sector organisations and more. This is all of you. The Centre for Child Protection aims to get to the heart of child protection training using innovative ideas, as can be seen in our multi-award-winning public engagement, impact and research portfolio. We offer CPD certified training sessions using interactive and engaging child protection simulations, and we deliver a postgraduate programme in advanced child protection, including a master's, postgraduate diploma, postgraduate certificate and standalone modules, which are for multidisciplinary child protection professionals and are all available via distance learning. We are currently celebrating our 10-year anniversary via a series of events, including this webinar series, Critical Conversations, which has plans to continue in the next year and beyond. We also have a live celebration in Canterbury on the 9th of November, with keynote speaker, Professor Eileen Munro. Places are limited, so do book quickly. Finally, we also have our inaugural Collaboration Award 2022, which will celebrate outstanding multi-protection working. It comes with a £500 award too, so do get your nominations in. We will share web links to details about the Centre's activities in the chat for you to learn more. Before I introduce the main event, just a few housekeeping notes. Please note that we are recording this session for a time-limited public distribution. Your videos and microphones are disabled for a few reasons. Briefly, this is to ensure a smooth, easy to hear, GDPR sensitive experience for all of you. The chat feature is enabled to encourage discussion, questions and networking. However, a few quick notes about the chat. First, chat will not be recorded. We ask that you please use chat responsibly and respectfully of others. The presenter will not be able to read and respond to the chat. However, we have chat monitors who will answer non-specialist questions and or pull out key questions for the presenter, which will be reserved for the last 10 to 15 minutes of the session. So please use the chat to ask questions. We will try to get to all your questions. However, we may run out of time. If there's anything urgent, you can contact us separately. Finally, please join us on social media. You can tweet about the event at the following hashtag CCP10 and or hashtag critical conversations. Okay, without further ado, let's get ready for our primary event. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce to you Dr. Tracee Green, who is the head of the Centre for Child Protection and Senior Lecturer, for this webinar entitled Standardised Measures, Friend or Foe, Parenting Assessments in Court with a focus on Parenting Assessment Manual Software or PAMS. Tracee has taught on the Centre's postgraduate programmes, provided CPD training and led in the creation of the social worker degree apprenticeship. She's a registered social worker with 14 years of experience working with children and families, completing parenting and risk assessments for court, as well as providing a broad variety of support, help and intervention services. She is going to talk with you today about standardised measures in the assessment of parenting, with a particular focus on her PhD findings linked to parenting assessment manual software. Tracee, I'm handing this over to you now.
Thank you very much, Venetia. It's a lovely introduction.
We can't hear you, Tracee.
We can.
Can you not hear me?
I can hear you, Tracee.
You can hear me okay?
Yeah, that's absolutely
okay.
fine.
All right. Can I just double check that everybody else can hear me all right? Just in the chat, if you could just pop a message in there.
Yes, people are saying that.
Yeah, it's okay, Tracee.
All right, brilliant, brilliant. So again, thank you, Venetia, for a really lovely introduction. And it's great to see everybody here at the webinar. I'm going to be offering a very broad look at the use of standardized measures in child protection work today. So after an overview, I'll use some of my own research on one particular standardized tool, which is PAMS, to consider its usefulness to practice according to practitioners. And I'm hoping what this does is adds to a larger scale debate on using standardized measures in child protection work. Now to start, can I get a sense, I want to start a poll. Chiara, if you could start the poll now. I want to get a sense of how you all feel about using standardized tools. Do you see them as friend or foe? Hopefully the poll has come up now, but if you can choose whether you find it very useful, mixed, neutral usefulness, maybe not useful at all, or maybe you're just not sure and you don't use any. I've tried to play to the title of my presentation, and I don't know how well that's worked, but it is laid out so that you can choose friend, foe, acquaintance, and so on. So we'll give that just a couple of seconds and see what comes through. Should we close that up now, Chiara? Let's have a look at the results. Very interesting. So some of you are not familiar, you're not using tools. We do have a divide there a little bit between useful and not useful, but a lot of people are somewhere in the middle. So it's a really interesting place to start and look. The next thing I'd just like you to do is in the chat, if you could just, I won't be able to read your chat during my presentation, but if you could just add in the chat some of the tools you are using to inform your practice, that would be really helpful for me to look at later to get a sense of what's going on and what's being used. So, and it might even generate some discussions between everybody as well if you're using some of the same tools. So in the chat, if you could just go ahead and share some of the tools that you're using in your child protection settings, that would be great. Thank you. So let's just jump right in now. So I would imagine everybody here is profoundly aware that child protection is one of the most high stakes realms within which decisions are made. Consideration of significant harm to a child is a really serious professional challenge. Any professional decision to act or not to act carries risk, and we may step in too early or we may come in too late, with either version possibly resulting in tragic consequences. Now, there are expectations in recent years to overcome the risk of harm, to find a more foolproof vehicle to undertake child protection. But the consensus is that whether a decision-making tool has low accuracy or high accuracy, there's still going to be fallibility, meaning there's always that risk for mistake, for error to occur. Now, in these charts on my slide now, you'll see on the left axis, that's the measures that degree of actual abuse. And on the other axis here on the bottom, that measures the assessed risk of harm. That is how that harm is being perceived. Now, as you can see on these charts, this isn't a perfect system of prediction. If it was perfect, then the little plus signs would be lined up right alongside this green line here, with real and identified risk being the same, but it is not a perfect system and it has outliers. Now, you could argue that an aim of child protection work is to increase accuracy of decision-making outcomes, which is partly what we'll be discussing a little bit today. But I do want to caveat this in the context that there's no zero failure paradise in child protection. That's why even with high accuracy decision-making, there are still imperfections. Now let's have a look at two particular types of errors. You've got false positives and false negatives. Now with the false positive, as the assessed degree of risk goes up, the actual danger remains quite low. A false positive is when a risk may be falsely assessed as being dangerous, but there's not actual danger to a child. We think there is, but there isn't. So that assessed risk of harm is high, even though the actual harm is low. Now, with a false negative, as the danger of risk actually goes up, that assessed risk remains quite low. And that's a false negative. It's when that risk is falsely cleared of concern, but there is actual danger to a child, and we don't intervene, and perhaps we close the case. Now, let's put this in the context of thresholds and serious risk. We're using the same table from my previous slides. However, this blue horizontal line in the middle indicates serious risk, whereby perhaps the most severe interventions are needed. This black horizontal line indicates the threshold. This black line indicates the threshold where limited resources are released to service providers. Now, if we have a high threshold for service involvement, that is, it's harder to meet the criteria for involvement of services, we have a high amount of false negatives. That is, we're missing situations where children are at need and where we're not fulfilling our statutory obligations to protect children from harm. The good news is that there are very much fewer false positives, though there's still some, because remember, this isn't a perfect system. Now, if we have a lower threshold for service intervention, that is, it's easier for us to meet, easier for families to meet criteria for involvement, we reduce those false negatives. And we actually capture most of those actually dangerous cases, though again, there's still some errors. It's not a perfect system. But we're more readily meeting that statutory obligation to protect children from significant harm. It sounds great, however, we're also increasing these false positives. That is, people who are not going to cause harm to their child are lumped, or significant serious harm to their child, are lumped into the same category. We're interfering with their right to private family life, perhaps unnecessarily. Now, what I hope this highlights is that, again, child protection is not a straightforward risk process, and risk management is always going to be a somewhat imperfect system. Therefore, trying to eliminate risk, such as in tragic cases like baby Peter, Victoria, Star Arthur, brings tensions really high. We want to reduce the risk, but is it reasonable? We're walking a tight rope between being too draconian on the one hand and not responsive enough on the other hand. Now, one key element in that decision-making process is around risk is professional judgment, otherwise referred to as clinical judgment, individual judgment. Sometimes I've seen it referred to as professionalism too. And this involves using knowledge, behaviors, and skills that are linked to things like legislation, ethics, theory, research, past experiences. And this sort of specialist abstract knowledge with discretionary space and strong accountability, it's something that we own, we hold, we've made, comes with some difficulties. Now, it can be argued that professional judgment is an essential staple in child protection work in order for us to avoid oversimplifying complex aspects of human existence. So it highlights, it's really important and some would say, and I would agree, necessary to meet the needs of individuals. We deal with very complex, uncertain, ambiguous, fallible family situations, which need us to apply a more sensible, local, contextual, cultural knowledge, which can be both explicit and implicit. So professional judgment is needed. Now, I want to look really briefly at what's involved in the decision-making process. There's a lot of research looking at decision-making. Have at the material, it's really interesting, but I'm going to use Platt and Turney's naturalistic approach to highlight this range of different factors that are influencing and impacting on professional decision-making, including things like gathering knowledge about the children and family we're working with, collaborating and working with others to triangulate and share information to get a bigger picture of the family's true lived experiences, incorporating structural factors, which are enforced and reinforced by within frontline workers' day-to-day efforts. That is, understanding our legal responsibilities, our access to resources, organizational culture, supervision, and so on. We also have individual professional factors, which look at our values, our experiences, our knowledge base, and our emotional response to work as well. And finally, Platt and Turney state that we then engage in sense-making with all this information. That's the analysis element. What we do with all of that information, we make sense of it, we sense make. They suggest we do this through a number of key steps that draw on somewhat individualistic ways of processing data. It might be looking at our experiences, heuristics, operational strategies, and pattern recognition, for example. Now, I think it can be argued that it's essential we keep professional judgment within decision-making processes and child protection work. However, there are concerns that by using professional judgment alone with that individualistic nature of sense-making, that we may limit accuracy. There's ample evidence that child protection professionals are good at gathering information about families, but they might find it a challenge to analyze or sense make with that information. It's complex information, and that complex information needs to be pulled together to make judgments of significant harm and whether action should be taken. In fact, there are some studies highlighting that using professional judgment alone is only slightly better than guessing. Therefore, as highlighted in my earlier slide, if we want to reduce those false negatives and false positives, we need to enhance professional judgment to increase accuracy. Now, one such way to do this is perhaps through evidence-based practices, such as using standardized measures. Which brings me to my next slide here. Now, there are a lot of standardized measures. A number of them have been developed to support professional decision-making, but it's important to note that many tools really do need further piloting and validation for their use in the UK child protection context. Nonetheless, they hold a lot of promise to child protection workers, and that can maybe support that professional decision-making process. I should add that there are many tools to explore here, and I don't have expertise in all of them. You'll be pleased to hear as well that I'm not actually going to attempt to go through all of them in this short session. And there are many more that I'm not even aware of, I'm sure too. But I do want to introduce the idea of them here. So standardized measures or tools range in their ability to increase accuracy. So again, no measure can create that zero failure paradise. However, there is promising research to suggest that standardized measures make that noteworthy increase in decision-making accuracy and that they move beyond professional judgment alone. And they do this by providing practitioners with clear guidance on how to focus an assessment process and to analyze data. Characteristically, they provide forms, they provide guidelines for pre-decided actions, they create procedural standards, and they prescribe the behavior of professionals. And again, there are a number of different types of standardized measures, including consensus-based tools and empirical statistical tools. Now, with a consensus-based tool, they're created through professional and literature-based knowledge and an analysis of factors which are typically used when making assessments of maltreatment. And these factors are brought together into a scheme which is applied to a risk assessment. Now, signs of safety and the graded care profile are good examples of consensus-based tools. With the empirical statistical tools, they're created based on statistically predictive factors for maltreatment, which are brought together into a scheme that's scored numerically to assess risk. The structured decision-making model is a toolkit which has a number of actuarial tools within it, and that's used in the USA. There aren't actually any actuarial tools that are tested for risk assessments in child protection and used in the UK right now. But what I have done is provided a couple of hyperlinks on this document on my PowerPoint slides, and I'll also try and get them onto the website too. They're both freely available to read a little bit more about standardized tools, with this latter one also containing a useful toolkit of scales, including the daily hassle scale and strengths and difficulties questionnaires, if you wanted to have a look at those. Now, I'd like us to have a quick overview of what research suggests are the strengths and the limitations of standardized assessment tools. And I want to draw out some of the most prominent discussions and present some standout contentious issues as well. So in terms of strengths, standardized tools and measures have clear strengths. As outlined in the literature, they're noted to be more reliable, more accurate at making judgments, particularly compared to subjective assessments alone. Now, studies are highly suggestive of stronger predictive ability from these tools, particularly the actuarial tools, but including consensus-based tools too. Now, there are benefits to being more transparent, more auditable to decision makers, that they have that stronger understanding of how practitioners' recommendations are being developed. Some standardized measures are also seen as a way to provide a more focused and structured assessment, while others appreciate a new language, let me get that up there we go, provided by some tools, which allows for more accurate expression of assessment findings. This might sound quite good. Maybe I'm swinging some of you in favor of standardized measures, but it's really important to consider them alongside the critiques in the literature too. For example, there are concerns that child protection work can be oversimplified by using standardized measures, and that this loses that individual uniqueness of the families we work with, as well as the individual uniqueness of the practitioner and what they bring to. There's concerns of managerialism, whereby there are fears that decision-making tools favor the needs of management and tick lists. There are concerns that the use of standardized measures increase workload, that they can be time-consuming to learn and to implement. There are growing concerns that there are heightened and unwarranted certainties when using a standardized tool. After all, again, these tools are not foolproof, so there might be an expectation they do more than they say on the tin. And finally, there is some cause for concern that workers are resistant and evasive to embedding standardized measures into their work. Now, I think any of those points just considered could go into the contentious basket as well, but there are a few really specific arguments which appear to swing back and forth regarding the value of standardized tools. And there are suggestions that, for example, standardized tools strengthen professional roles. That is, that they build the practitioner's confidence and they provide additional legitimacy to what they do. But on the other hand, it's also thought that they're a threat to professional autonomy and to professional discretion. For example, they think that maybe standardized tools will result in practitioners losing or perhaps never even acquiring professional judgment and critical reflection skills. People also like how tools generate information that would have been otherwise missed, and some suggest that tools can help them also analyze that information. But on the other hand, this needs to be considered alongside concerns that information can be excessive when you're using standardized tools, that there's concern about what to do with it, or that all that information can become cumbersome or difficult to process and analyze. Another key point of concern is around working relationships. Some findings suggest that a standardized measure can increase working relationships between the assessor and the assessed, whereby others suggest that there's a detrimental impact to the relationship when you use a standardized tool. And finally, I've said it before, I'll probably say it again, but I do want to stress the point made that standardized tests need to be evaluated, tested, and analyzed for their use within the child protection context in the UK. So most tools, not all of them, but most of them still need empirical validation in this setting. Okay, I'm going to change direction a little bit now, and I'm going to introduce my research, which was looking at a particular standardized tool, PAMS, or Parenting Assessment Manual Software. Now, this tool is designed to support exploration of a parent or a carer's ability to meet their child's needs, while also having a strong presence in the literature as a tool that can be really useful to use with parents who have learning difficulties. A PAMS is an evidence-based, multi-dimensional assessment tool, and it's designed to provide a more systematic and functional method for assessing parents, placing it more in that consensus-based realm on the assessment toolkits. It's been developed to present complex information in a format that interfaces well with the framework for the assessment of children in need and their families. However, unlike that framework, it's not freely available and it does come with some cost. Now, PAMS does not claim to be a psychometric tool that provides a more numerical score that determines if parenting capacity is suitable or not. That is, it's not that empirical statistical tool. You don't get a score and think, oh, yep, that's a concern, we need to act, or no, it's not, we don't need to act. In fact, PAMS does not claim at all to eliminate subjectivity from an assessment. It recognizes the need for the assessor to make professional judgments about parenting ability, including difficulties in determining that good enough parenting concept. But it does provide guidelines. It provides example answers to aid the assessor in making some of those judgments. Now, there is research to highlight that PAMS has good inter-rater reliability, which means that if two people assess the same family, they might come up with the same kind of results. However, aside from that, and then my study, which I'm talking about here, there are no other empirical studies on use of PAMS within parenting assessments for court in particular. Now, I think it's important to note briefly here that my focus studied on PAMS 3.0, but following my study, about maybe midway through or almost towards the end, a new version of PAMS was released, and that was PAMS 4.0. Now, the differences between the two are notable, but they're not thought to impede on this study. Process and content were relatively unchanged, but the changes within PAMS 4.0 were more with regard to explanation. For example, it offered stronger description of process, timelines, made training a requirement, and so on. So there are upgrades, but it's not thought to impact on my research findings. Now, as a summary, the incorporation of PAMS into an assessment could include a variety of tools which come together to support an assessment. You've got some pre-assessment tools. One's completed by the referral source, whoever's referring them for a PAMS assessment, and the other's completed by the parent before the assessment starts in full. And that just gives you a sense of where people are at the very beginning, where they see risks or strengths. There are a number of other tools, which I'm not going to go into here, that make up the heart of the assessment process. But again, I'm not going to go into great detail with them here, other than to highlight that a few key tools and outputs could be included in a PAMS assessment, or are included in a PAMS assessment. Now let's have a quick look at my methodology now. One of my research questions asked, how do professionals who've used PAMS within parenting assessments for court perceive the incorporation of PAMS? Now, my findings demonstrate perceived value of the assessment tool from a professional perspective versus an actual assessment of the quality or the accuracy of the PAMS tool. So please bear this in mind. Now, I used a mixed methods approach, including both quantitative and qualitative methodologies. For my quantitative, I used an online questionnaire sent to practitioners who use PAMS. And for my qualitative methodology, I used semi-structured telephone interviews with, again, practitioners who used PAMS. For the questionnaires, I used a whole population sample of about 3,000 PAMS trained assessors. However, my specifications were specific and reduced this. I wanted people who had PAMS 3.0, not older versions. PAMS 4.0 wasn't available at this point, but I wanted to make sure I was targeting people who used 3.0. And I also wanted to target specifically those using them for court assessments. So this reduced the sampling pool to around 550 to 750 potential participants, of which only 54 participated in the online questionnaire. And that's about a 7 to 10% response rate, which is quite low, but it still has some merit. For my interviews, 37 out of the 54 participants from the questionnaire volunteered to be part of the interview process. But I only used 11 because I reached theoretical saturation, which meant that there was no new data or information coming from my interviews. I used theoretical purposive sampling, which meant that I targeted a range of PAMS perspectives. So from the questionnaire, I was able to identify people who liked PAMS, didn't like PAMS, and who loved PAMS, so that I could have a broad range of perspectives as part of my interview findings. Oops. Now let's have a quick look at some of my findings. Now, preferences regarding the use of this standardized tool ranged from a strong pro-PAMS stance, whereby some participants confessed to love using it, to a moderate PAMS stance where some didn't mind using it, to an anti-PAMS stance where some said they hate it a little bit. Now, the questionnaire indicated that the majority of participants preferred the use of PAMS, with about 54% saying that, And there were about 24% who didn't mind. They used it sometimes, but not all the time. And another group who preferred not to use it was about 20% as well. My study also highlighted a range of strengths and limitations and contentions in the use of PAMS. So some of the more uncontentious benefits, that is, nobody spontaneously disagreed with these points, included value in using an evidence-based procedure, having effective, helpful, useful system of analysis, having a clear focus on targeted areas of change, having access to visual aids and activities, and they liked the strengths-based approach. There was also a really strong view that PAMS was useful when working with parents who had learning difficulties, and that PAMS raised awareness of these parents being given a fair chance during an assessment for court. Now, some of the general limitations of using PAMS, which were also without any spontaneous contention, there were a number of those too. There was a real strong opinion that an assessment that included PAMS was only as good as the assessor. And this is something I'm going to come back to in a little bit as well. Some assessors also had expectations that PAMS would do more than it actually did. They found it could be time consuming, the software could be difficult to use, and some described it as a monotonous process. Some felt that PAMS impacted negatively on that relationship building process between the assessor and the assessed, particularly if the parent did not have a learning difficulty, as they felt the material could be patronizing to some parents. But there were other participants who felt they were able to overcome that patronized feeling by explaining the process, by highlighting how parents have been given a chance to demonstrate a broader range of skills, and generally using their skills of engagement and interaction. So finally, some also felt that PAMS was more limited to the social work professionals, but I should note that although the majority of my participants in this research were social workers, there was a range from health professionals and unqualified family support workers, as well as some other people as well. Now, one significant contradiction was that some participants felt that PAMS was a comprehensive tool in assessing parenting, where others felt that PAMS needed more development and more guidance. There was also a point connected to that point, really, that whether the standardized nature of PAMS is useful or not. So some found that standardization helpful and others didn't. So some participants liked that standardized process. They felt confident to be flexible and creative in identifying and adding this material outside of PAMS that they felt was necessary. They liked how that standardized process gave them a guide to follow and kept them on track, but others felt that they were unable to work flexibly within PAMS, and they wanted less standardization. They wanted more freedom to express and utilize and apply more professional judgment. Now, another contentious point regarding general elements of PAMS is whether PAMS is useful within court work or not. Some participants felt strongly that PAMS supports obtaining strong evidence to use in the courts, for example, bolstering arguments, providing a strong framework, being fair to parents, covering a lot of ground, and so on. Others felt strongly that PAMS was not developed for the courts, and so it remained lacking. For example, they felt it didn't specifically address enough detail or cover too broad a spectrum, and they didn't think it covered the relevant focal points in enough detail for the courts. Now, my findings also explored contentious and uncontentious benefits and limitations of each of the individual tools within PAMS. You can see my PhD write-up for further details if this is something you want to learn more about, but I just don't have time to go on all of them here. So I've limited my disclosure to findings more linked to an overview of the general use of the standardized tool versus each individual tool within it. Now, what I'd like to do in the last couple of slides that I've got here is I'd like to discuss a few key points by comparing what I learned from the literature, some of my earlier slides, to what I learned in my research on the use of PAMS as a standardized tool. to look at how they compare when considering the value of using standardized tools within parenting, within assessments. So my findings did link to the wider literature discussed earlier in a number of different ways. The uncontested positive elements of PAMS found in my research corroborate findings from the literature that standardized measures are more focused, that they're more structured, and they provide more clarity. There's also research to indicate good inter-rater reliability between PAMS assessors, which suggest a stronger reliability. It is not clear if it's found to be more accurate and predictive, and more studies are needed to explore this. The evidence-based and procedural element of PAMS does seem to hold promise in enhancing transparency, auditability, but how the tool is being used does need some clarification, since there can be variations, which I'll mention in a minute. Now, my findings do not confirm a new language, which the research suggested, but there are suggestions that PAMS offers that stronger base of support to assess and to express the needs of parents who have learning difficulties, which is quite interesting. There are concerns that standardized tools can, as I've said before, oversimplify practice and have that managerialist focus. That is, we aren't doing enough to identify the uniqueness of practice, and we're becoming more tick box and managerialistic led. Interestingly, I think one key message from my participants was that PAMS was only as good as the assessor, suggesting the tool isn't necessarily the answer or the problem, but that some consideration of how the practitioner uses the tool alongside their other skills is that point for further consideration. Meaning PAMS, maybe some other standardized tools, could accommodate additional assessment tasks that expand on the tool design. Now, this does link to concerns about unwarranted heightened certainty though. So do we expect tools to do too much? Is it given too much weight because it's a standardized tool, despite the strengths and fallibility of the practitioners using them and the strengths and fallibilities of the tools themselves? Now, additionally, practitioners did raise concern that they thought PAMS would do more than it did. And this was not limited to practitioner expectations, but to the expectations of others who expected or who read or who utilized the results. They expected it to perhaps be more accurate and predictive than it may be. Now, we certainly need to understand and to be open about the limitations of the tools that we use. We need to make sure we're telling people about those limitations, because remember, nothing is 100% accurate. Now, my findings from PAMS corroborate findings from the literature that standardized tools can be time consuming, that they can increase workload, with PAMS and additionally adding things such as finding a monotonous process, and that the software could be difficult. Now, with this in mind, there's no wonder that workers are resistant and perhaps evasive to standardized measures. However, there are some really interesting studies from particularly Latch et al., which I think is 2021, and that will be in my reference list at the end. And there was Latch and Bastian 2017, I believe, again in my reference list. Now, Latch et al. From the 2021 reference, they talk about skill, they talk about planning, wider ecological considerations needed to successfully integrate a new standardized assessment tool within an organization. They talk about how it has to be top down, bottom to the top, it has to be collaborative, it has to be give and take from the very beginning to embed it and make it work within an organization. But Bastian's 2017 research has another perspective as well, where they talk about the negotiation of implementing a standardized tool. And it's not just the negotiation between workers and their organization, but between workers and the organization and the tool itself. There's almost like, so the tool itself is part of the negotiation process. People need to see how they can shape the core of a tool to complement their work, which takes time and some flexibility from that tool as well. So my findings also talk a little bit on the slide about the patronizing ambiguity, but I'm going to talk about that more on my next slide. It's my second to last slide. Now, I should note that any of the previously mentioned strengths and limitations can be considered contentious depending on who you talk to and what you're going to read. But as a general rule, again, there are just a few that highlight that more heated debate. And for starters, coming back to that relationship ambiguity, whether these standardized tools support or hinder working relationships. Now, PAMS users highlighted this concern that the working relationship could be damaged by using PAMS, with some questions thought to be just too easy, or maybe that these questions are being asked in a rote fashion. What do you feed your children? What would you do in this situation? What do you consider abuse? However, there are really clear and interesting debates about whether good practitioner skills can overcome that patronizing element and lead to a more positive working relationship by using tools. Bringing this point back to what I said earlier about things are only, PAMS is only as good as the assessor using it. And perhaps this spreads more widely to other standardized tools as well. And it's how sometimes these tools are being used versus the tools themselves. There is also contention regarding whether a standardized tool enhances or jeopardizes the professional role. Can a tool like PAMS be used to support the development of practitioner skills, to make the assessment or the assessor better over time? Some believe tools like PAMS can help with this, but others think that standardized tools stagnate professional development and lead professionals down a line of rote tallies and tick lists without knowledge of the importance or the reasoning for the questions being asked. Now, depending on the individual and the tool and the context, I think there is promise of professional development using standardized tools. PAMS practitioners were divided on this too, though. Some really liked the standardization and found it offered enough flexibility to incorporate professional judgment into their assessments. In fact, PAMS itself clearly states that the tool is not a replacement for professional judgment. Still, some wanted more flexibility with the tool, with many taking this flexibility as well. In a previous publication of mine by Green and Weber, which also is in the reference list, my findings highlighted a significant variation in how PAMS is used, with 3 different types. You've got a PAMS Plus, which is a structured, limited modification that's applied at 2 different points in time, which is great for assessing change. You also have a full PAMS, which is a structured use with limited modifications, and it's applied once. And then you have a PAMS Informed, which has limited structure, significant modifications, and it's applied once. Suggesting that there is a lot of variation in how these are used. And in none of those versions was there no modifications. There was always some modifications, maybe more modifications and more informal, less structured applications, but there were always some modifications. For example, maybe using, omitting a couple of questions on a more structured version versus maybe just using the odd questions and maybe the more informal, unstructured versions. Now, another contention is the amount of information generated with some tools, with, again, some seeing this as a benefit, highlighting that there's information that would have otherwise been missed, but others see it as this hindrance because additional information means additional processing and analysis for content and meaning. Now, many tools offer support with this analysis, and PAMS is one of those tools. Now, my research, my participants did not suggest that PAMS created too much information. In fact, some liked that comprehensive coverage they perceived it to be offering, and others still found that the coverage might have been lacking and they wanted more information. So they built upon this more, for example, using the adult attachment interview in addition to the PAMS toolkit. Now, lastly, I won't stick to this point too long, as we've covered it really in previous slides, but tools need to undergo robust evaluation and testing for use in the UK child protection arena. This was also raised by PAMS practitioners, highlighting that contention, with some seeing it as a great tool to use in the courts and talking about how respected it was there, with others highlighting that limited empirical testing for using this tool in that setting, having a concern about how it was being put onto a pedestal without that right empirical backing. Okay, so should we use standardized assessments? Are they friend Are they faux? There is certainly some difference of opinion in the literature, much like Marmite. Some really like standardized tools, while others don't, which was highlighted in the questionnaire we did, the poll that we did at the very beginning here. So I think it can be argued that standardized tools can increase accuracy, that they can limit errors, two important elements of assessment in child protection, which we talked about earlier. But such tools, and I do think that they can be valuable in aiding structured professional decision-making, but they cannot replace professional observation and judgment. They need the right consideration around implementation and application too, as well as future studies to explore accuracy and impact on specific tools in the UK child protection context. So yes, I think standardized tools can be helpful, but as a complement to professional judgment. I'm going to open up that same poll again. Kiara, can you just open that up? And I want to see if anybody's come in late, whether there's different perspectives, if everybody, or maybe you've changed your mind as well. So if you just have a go and fill out the same poll once again, and we'll have a look at what that looks like in case we missed anybody or if there's been a shift in thinking. We give that just a couple of seconds, and then I'll be really happy to take any questions. I think that should be okay, Kiara, if we want to close that and show the results. Oh, there are no more foes. We used to have more foes. I think mixed increased a little bit more there. Excellent. Lovely. Thank you, everybody, for humoring me on those polls. Really interesting. And if I could just open it up to any questions now, if that's all right.
Yeah. Hi, Tracee. Thank you for that superb webinar. I certainly learned a lot. Thank you very much. So we do have a few questions. So the first is actually an observation, and but we can kind of convert it into a question, I think. So it's about the variance, I think, in how standardized tools can be used across organizations and dependent on managers, who may favor one more than the other. So is there anything you can say about how practitioners can have consistency when using these tools, how they themselves can achieve consistency?
Well, these are the studies I cited earlier. The one by Latch et al., which I think is 2021, and the one by Bastian 2017. They're really interesting studies which look at how they should be implemented, and they take a really, I think, nice approach to looking at it. I think it was Latch et al. Who looked at this more ecological perspective to introduce it from sort of top down, bottom up, having people involved in the very beginning of it, talking about this is something we're looking at. And I say people, I mean everybody, the people who will be using the tools, the managers who will be supervising it, and everybody needs an investment and a buy-in and some time to think and feel part of that decision-making process about whether that tool will be used. I know when we implemented PAMS within my team, there was a division there initially about, do we like this tool? Don't we like this tool? And everybody really just wanted to have their voice heard about what they saw as the strengths and the limitations and how we were going to maneuver and manage around that to make it work within our organization. So that's Latch et al. If you wanted to read it. And again, it's in my reference list, which will be on the website, and you can have a look at that. And then again, Bastian's article was looking a little bit more at that negotiation process, about how the tools aren't necessarily a static thing, that it almost talks about this relationship between the person using the tool and the tool themselves and how you're going to use it. And in my research as well, there's a lot of variation in how PAMS was being applied and used, and it so that it complemented what that worker needed to do, but it still offered guidance and support and structure.
Thanks, Tracee. That's great. Another question is, do you have any thoughts on who should complete the assessment? Should it be the social worker assigned to the family or someone independent? And also, aside from PAMS, are there only a few models that courts will accept? This delegate only knows of PAMS and CUBAs. So the first part of that question is who should complete it?
I think this is mixed. I think social workers who are, perhaps if that's what you mean, social workers who are holding a case, I think there is potential for them to complete it. And I think it depends on the situation and the context in particular. Social workers have the skills to do it. Do they have time to do it? But on the other hand, I mean, it's not a simple yes or no, or this person or that person. So I think it's based very much on the context of the situation and the family. Equally, I think there is a lot of debate in the literature about that independence and the value of having somebody separate from the social worker, that outside opinion. Now you have, particularly in the courts, if we're looking at that, you have CAFCAS who are an independent, impartial representation of the child's voice. But is it useful to have another member? And I think sometimes in those more contentious cases, it can be really useful to have an external person. But equally, I also think social workers have the expertise to be able to do these things if they had the right training to support them in it.
And do you know, can you comment on, in terms of the court's perceptions, is PAMS looked upon, say, more favourably than some of the other assessment tools practitioners use?
I can't say definitively whether it is. I can say my research participants thought it was looked upon more favourably. I had some who had concerns that it was being put on a pedestal. And it's not that they didn't think it had value. It's just, like I was saying before, that sort of unwarranted backing of tools, or thinking that they're just doing too much than they do. So I've kind of gone down a little rabbit hole with that question, because there's so many threads to it, actually. I think it is held in high regard anecdotally and from my participants in my research. I think PAMS tends to be particularly held in high regard with parents who have learning difficulties. But there are other tools that can be used too. I don't think it's necessarily at the detriment to using other tools, but I think PAMS tends to hold some sort of gold standard with parents with learning disabilities, but there is no research to say that I'm aware of right now.
So just linked to that, one of the delegates uses graded care profile too. And how does that compare with PAMS in your opinion and through your research?
I haven't used the graded care profile in any detail. I know about it, I know it's being used, and I know it's a similar type of tool. It's that consensus-based tool, the graded care profile. And I've heard good things about it. But in terms of how it compares to PAMS, I do not know it as well as I know PAMS. So I'm not sure I could offer a really good comparative analysis between the two. So I might leave that one.
Okay. And this is quite a nice one. Can you give some examples of how professionals try to resolve some of the contentions with using standardized tools in practice?
Yeah, I mean, I think this comes back to the earlier question we had as well, where we had this in my work setting in particular. So when we introduced PAMS into an independent assessment center, and we did a lot of parenting assessments for court, and we would use PAMS, and there was again contentions in the team that people thought, oh, I don't want to keep doing the same thing, but other people actually, when we're doing the same thing, we got the same information we can analyze and work from. So there were divided opinions. And I think it's about not shutting people down. It's about listening to them, hearing what they have to say, and having some flexibility with the tools in terms of how we're going to implement and use them, so that we aren't destroying professional autonomy, professional judgment, and that we're building that into how we're using the tools.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thanks, Tracee. That's really helpful. I think we've got time for a couple more. This is around regarding risk assessments. So do you think that, I'm not sure if you're aware of the FRASA, F-R-A-S-A, whether it's compatible with PAMS. I think it's really good to sort of learn about lots of assessment tools that practitioners are using. So I think there is this point about overload. Could you say anything about possible overload, and dependent on, say, a manager may have, like I said earlier, preferences, how practitioners cope with this overload, especially if they're coming new into the profession?
I mean, with PAMS, I can speak from a PAMS perspective, because that's the one that I think I have some expertise on. I don't have as much expertise on the FRASA either. I think I've heard of it, but I'm actually, if you could unacronym it in the chat, that would be really helpful as well, because I think I know which one you're talking about. Now, some work in complement with others better than, I mean, I think there's always a complement between them, but you don't want to be using every tool out there. So there has to be a decision about what you're going to use and what you're not going to use. For example, signs of safety is a really useful framework overview. It provides that consensus-based family risk and safety assessment. Thank you. Signs of safety provides that overview and that sort of structure, but it's not to say you couldn't include PAMS in some sort of part of that assessment, but you don't want to include everything within the signs of safety. So there has to be some give and take, and it might be that some practitioners want to complement an overall organizational investment in a particular tool. So maybe your organization is invested in disseminating signs of safety or the graded care profile or the family risk and safety assessment. And that's your responsibility in the organization to work and make that happen. But perhaps you will choose some other tools to complement that work, but it doesn't have to be all of the tools. I don't know if that helps answer your question a little bit, but we can't use them all, but we can certainly add to as we use our professional judgment to decide what's valuable for us.
I have asked delegates to contact you because I don't think we're going to get around to answering all of the questions today. So I just want to reiterate that. So please do contact Dr. Tracee Green post this webinar if you have any specific questions, because I think this is a very specialist area. So we probably can't cover responses to all the different types of tools that are currently being used. I think there is this theme coming through in terms of it being dependent on who's completing the assessment as well, and whether it would be better to have more effective training for practitioners around assessment rather than introducing tools which still then do depend upon an individual perspective. If there's any final sort of comment on that, Tracee, that'd be great.
I think the tools, I mean, when you go back to some of those earlier slides I had, the tools do have some finding in the literature, some more than others. So there's a range of impacts on them, but using some of these standardized tools is shown to increase accuracy and to reduce errors. So to eliminate them from our assessment process completely without thought, I think isn't the right way to go. But I think that there does need to be thinking about how they're going to be used. And I think it absolutely has to be done alongside the development of practitioner knowledge, practitioner behaviors, their skills, their communication skills, how they're going to use the tool. It's not just a matter of sitting down with the tool and answering a question, you get a response. Answer another question, you get a response. There has to be a relationship that's built with that person. If you noticed on my very last slide here, I'm just going to pop it up again. Oh no, I didn't. There was a quote I was going to use, but I didn't use. But Eileen Monroe has a really good quote about how it's not, the tools are the tools, but it doesn't stop the practitioner from using their skills when they're using the tool. So we still have to engage in all those typical communication skills, relationship-based skills alongside the use of a tool. Just because you're using a tool doesn't mean you become a cold, distant practitioner. You still have to engage in all of those essential skills.
Thank you very much. We've reached 10 o'clock. That's been a very educational session, Tracee. Thank you. I just want to let all the delegates know that our next webinar in this series on the 12th of October from 1 to 2 p.m. Led by Dr. Aravinda Kosaraju, and it's on online child sexual exploitation and abuse, dilemmas and prospects for child safeguarding practitioners. And if you click on the links in the chat, you will have information on all of that. So do register, please. And slides and recording from this session will be made available to all of you. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll see you at the next one. Thank you. Bye.